Welcome to using the Texture 3D top for instancing. First, let's double click on our network and add a folder DAT. This is going to be the folder that we reference for all of the images in our instancing. Right away, we can see our root folder here is set to the location of our project file, but we want to look for the maps folder that comes with TouchDesigner. And we can secretly or not so secretly get to that by using the movie file in top. Here on the file parameter, we can actually see there's an expression that we can just go ahead and copy and then paste it into our root folder parameter. Now we can see that we are looking here at this apps folder, but we want to make sure that we get the map subfolder and we don't actually want this banana.tiff. So I'm going to go ahead and erase that. And now we can see here we have all of these images that come with TouchDesigner. Perfect. For our type parameter, let's just set this to files. And then let's turn off all extensions. And for our extensions parameter, let's just set that to .jpg. These are the images that are going to be in our instances. There are 12 in total. And we are going to actually use our movie file in to load those images. Before I do that, I am going to add a null after my folder dat. You can do that by right-clicking and adding a null or using Alt-N if you're on Windows, Option-N if you're on a Mac. Then I'm going to rename this to null folder. Great. I'm going to bring my movie file in over here, click on my movie file in, and I'm going to just go ahead and click and drag my null folder on to my file parameter of my movie file in. We want that because we wanted to start writing an expression that looks for the rows and columns of our null folder. We want all of this path information for all of our rows. So to write this expression, I'm going to move this over here so we can see it. After our op null folder, I'm going to open bracket, and then I'm going to write int, open parentheses, me.time.frame, close parentheses, comma, and then I'm going to add a single quotation mark, path, close quotation mark, and then I'm going to close my bracket. You'll see here that we have a flicker of images and then we go back to black. And so what's going on here is that this expression is pulling one row at a time from our DAT, where the row is an integer of me.time.frame and the column is information from our path here, this path column. We see that flicker of images and then we go to black, and that's because we're using me.time.frame as the reference for the row that we're looking at. This warning here is because it fails to open any files that are past the number of rows that we have, but that's okay. We actually don't have any performance issues from using this expression. But if you wanted to get rid of this warning, you can check out the learn.derivative.ca site to see the project file and check out the longer expression for removing that warning. All right, now that we have our movie file in, that's perfect. Let's actually right-click on that and add a Texture 3D top. Our Texture 3D is an incredibly handy operator. It is similar to a cache top in that it stores images into memory. The cache top uses a first in, first out behavior for storing images, where each new frame pushes an old frame out of memory. Meanwhile, the Texture 3D top behaves more like a circular buffer, where the index of a newly added image moves through memory and loops around once it reaches the end. On our Texture 3D, for the type parameter, let's set this to 2D texture array because we don't need a 3D texture in this instance. Here for our prefill parameter, let's toggle that to on. The prefill parameter is an incredibly valuable feature on our Texture 3D top because it allows us to prefill the memory associated with this top. And we can use prefilling to load a selection of images into memory when our project starts, which is super handy. You'll notice here we have all these black empty frames, and that's because our cache size is set to 32. We actually want to reference the number of rows that we have here. And in case this changes, let's go ahead and drag our null folder onto our cache size, and then finish writing an expression. We want the number of rows. So let's add a period and then num, capital R for rows, and then we're going to subtract by 1 and then pulse. The reason why we subtracted by 1 is because we have a row for our name and we don't actually want that row. We only want all of the rows that have our images. This is perfect. We have our images that are ready to go. So I am going to just add a null using Alt-N, and I am going to name this null images. All right. Next up here, what we can do is let's go ahead and add a rectangle. This rectangle is going to serve as the billboard for where these images go onto. And so for the size of that, I'm going to go ahead and set the size X to 1.778 by 1 because that looks like that's the aspect ratio of a 16:9 image. Perfect. I'm going to add a null, so Alt-N, and I'm going to call this the null shape. This is the shape that we will be instancing. Great. Next up here is I'm going to add a grid SOP. The grid is where we will be placing our instances or our grid of images. For our size, I'm going to set this to 6 by 2.5. And we can actually see this a bit more clearly in terms of what our rows and columns look like by making this viewer active using A or this little plus here. And then while we're hovering over the grid, hitting the W key. We can see we have 20 by 20, but we actually want this to be 3 by 4 to match our 3 by 4 images we have here, our 12 images. The images will be instanced at each of these points on our grid. Perfect. I'm going to no longer make that viewer active and add a null and call this null grid. All right. Now to view our instances, we need to set up a render network. So up here, I'm going to add a light comp, and then I will add a camera comp. And then before I add my geometry comp, I'm just going to actually right click here on my null shape because this is the shape that we will be instancing. And on my comps, I'm going to add a geometry comp. Now we can see here that we have that connection right away, which is lovely. We can finish our render setup by adding a render top. Perfect. We have our rectangle. We are almost there. Here, what we want to do is we want to instance our rectangles on our grid. So we need the data from this grid. On my null grid, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a SOP to chop. This information is what we will be using for our instances. We have our TX, our TY, and our TZ, but I also know that I need this point index. So I'm going to toggle on point index, and now we see that we have these index samples. Next, I'm going to right click and add a null, or you can use Alt-N, and these will be my null instances. Perfect. On my geometry on the instance page, we're going to toggle instancing on. I'm going to drag my null instances onto my default instance op. And then for translate X, I'm going to set TX, my translate Y, TY, and then TZ for my translate Z. We can see they're already starting to appear, which is very exciting. On my instance 2 page, for the texture coordinate for W, that's where we want to place our index. I'm going to move the camera back so we can see our instances better. So on a camera, translate Y, let's bring that back to 10. So now we can see all of our instances. The only thing we have left here is to add a material. So let's add a constant mat, drag that on to our geo and select material. And then we're going to drag our null images onto our constant. And then we can see it goes to our color map. And now here we have all of our images instanced on this grid, looking beautiful, nice, and laid out. So that's how we can use the Texture 3D for working with instances.